of the Dartmouth Marine slips have been treated unfairly, Mr. Speaker, by their employer and by this government. In June of 2000, about 100 workers were laid off. Many of these men had worked at the shipyards for more than 20 years, and they have never received severance. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is this: what will it take for you and your government to investigate this matter and ensure that these men receive the severance that they're entitled to?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister of the Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. It's not something I'm fully aware of, so it's something that I will take under advisement and get some information. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your first supplementary.
That's the problem, Mr. Speaker. This government has been ignoring these workers now for too long. In New Brunswick, a group of St. John shipyard workers have also waited more than 3 years for severance from Irving Shipbuilding. Last week, the New Brunswick Labour Board ruled that Irving was guilty of unfair labour practices in the way it dealt with employee closure pay. Mr. Speaker, shipyard workers in both provinces have been treated unfairly. The difference is that in New Brunswick, there has been some action. So my question is this: when is your government going to do the right thing and protect the rights of these working men?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll certainly have discussions with the department and ensure we have a look into the situation and determine where it is at this point in time.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's been 3 years, and the former employees of the Dartmouth Marine slips are still waiting for the severance that they are due. These men have been treated unfairly, and they have been ignored by government. Minister, in light of the recent New Brunswick ruling, don't you think it's at least your responsibility, at the very least, to fully investigate the situation under the Industry Closing Act as you were supposed to in the first place?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
It's certainly a responsibility of the department to investigate complaints that come in, and I'm sure that we will or have.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, women's centres offer many essential services to women, especially in rural communities. Women's centres offer individual and career counselling, help in accessing services, and ongoing support. Yet funding cuts from 2002 have never been reversed, and centres are operating on a quarter-by-quarter basis with no long-term stable funding. Mr. Speaker, I ask the Minister of Community Services, why has this situation been allowed to continue for over a year?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for raising the question. There's a promise with the premise to the question because there have been no funding cuts to women's centres.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, provincial departments and agencies refer clients to women's centres. These clients have multi-issues. So obviously the government frontline workers and the voluntary sector recognize the need for these organizations. Transition to employment programs have enabled women with training and life skills needs to re-enter the workforce. These programs help the Department of Community Services in its mandate to encourage employment support recipients to find work. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, why doesn't his department give women's centres the funding they need to continue to help women and children break out of the cycle of poverty?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member opposite brings up an excellent point. The point is that a lot of these women's centres were born of HRDC grants, and it seemed to be important to the federal government at the time that they have that service. But the problem is that they then walked away from them when the grants ran out. And yes, the province did step in and provide $100,000 for each of these 7 women's centres, and we're proud to have done so.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the women's centres of Nova Scotia are providing essential services that would otherwise have to be provided by the Department of Community Services. So I don't recognize trying to lay the blame on another level of government. Just want to mention that another concern of the women's centres is the lack of funding to support their crisis intervention work. And without core funding, there are centers that may not survive another fiscal year. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister is, where will women be able to turn for these essential services if the Department of Community Services allows women's centers to close?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And once again, that is exactly why we protected the Women's Center's funding in the last budget. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister responsible for the status of women. Last week, I had the chance to ask the Minister responsible for the status of women a question about the status of transition houses and women's centres in this province. The Minister responsible responded by stating that the Council had not advised her that there were concerns expressed. Mr. Speaker, it is the responsibility of this Minister to voice the concerns of women at the Cabinet table. Given that the Minister has had a chance now to think about the question I asked last week and the government's track record of attacking the most vulnerable in society, my question to the Minister is, has the Minister spoken to the Minister of Community Services about not cutting transition houses and women's centres in next year's budget?
The Honourable Minister responsible for Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I stated last week when this question was asked, we definitely do value women in our government. We value women every day. We look at the amount of funding that is going into transition houses, and we are not proposed at this point in time to cut any money.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question really was whether or not the Minister had spoken to the Minister of Community Services about cutting money to transition houses in this year or next year's budget. So could the Minister perhaps go back to that first question? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I believe, as was mentioned by the Minister of Community Service, we are not proposing to cut funding to transition houses, so I do not feel that's an issue to sit down to relate at this point in time. He has obviously put it on the table that that cut is not in place.
Now, Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government will be cutting programs everywhere, in every department, to pay for their tax scheme. I think it's very pertinent today to find out whether vulnerable women and children are going to be part of that mix. This government attempted to cut services to women and children in 2002, and they will no doubt try again. My question to the Minister is, when will the Minister begin to advocate loudly on behalf of women and their families in this province?
Minister of Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Minister and government are committed to the safety of abused women and children in this province. We are continuing the $4 million that we have put into women's services across this province is a fair example of that commitment. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Don't you dare. Mr. Speaker, as you know, last week the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities held its annual conference, and property assessment rates were the focus of a lot of discussion. Councillor after councillor was arguing that the present system does not work. The municipalities pay the province quite handsomely to provide assessment services, but they can barely afford it. These are market-based and simplistic, and most importantly, they drive Nova Scotians off their land. We've been waiting for more than 3 years for this government to act on this issue. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Municipal Services is, why is your government refusing to work with the parties involved to find a solution to this problem?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this gives me an opportunity to inform the member opposite and all Nova Scotians that the opposite is the case. We have worked with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities, and we have worked with all municipalities to ensure that we have the most effective assessment service in this country, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic on your first supplementary.
Unfortunately, that's not the message that I was hearing, but I gather that the government is, in fact, considering regulations rather than legislation to deal with these skyrocketing assessment rates. It's a question a little bit like that we've heard earlier today concerning workmen's compensation. Yet again, it means that government plans will not come before the public, debate will not be transparent, and hasty decisions may well be made which will negatively affect thousands of Nova Scotians. My question is, how can this government possibly consider evading public debate on such a central issue?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, this gives me a great opportunity to inform the member opposite and all members of all Nova Scotians that, in fact, our party is committed to working with the Union of Nova Scotian Municipalities and all Nova Scotians to ensure that we have an adequate repair to the system so that it's effective for every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Atlantic on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, it appears that we have been studying this issue for some time. We're studying studies. I'm afraid we're about to go into studying the studies of the studies. But meantime, thousands of Nova Scotians are finding themselves saddled with property assessment rates that produce taxes they simply cannot afford. Minister, will the government bring those proposals before the House before the end of this session?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This question gives me another opportunity to share with the member opposite that we use the same system that's used nationwide. In fact, this is a system that is used in every province in this country. It's a system that is widely respected, and it's my belief, Mr. Speaker, that it's a system that works very well. I also want to share with the member opposite that it's my understanding that no person in this province has ever gone broke because of an assessment. It's
Order,
the tax
order,
bills.
please. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, from 1995 to 2000, Nova Scotia seniors did not see an increase in pharmacare premiums.
Order, please. First of all, there's too much noise in the chamber, and I'd ask whoever has a cell phone on, please turn it off as we agreed before session began. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from 1995 to 2000, Nova Scotia seniors did not see an increase in pharmacare premiums or the copay. And since then, pharmacare premiums have gone from $215 to $337. The copay has gone from $200 to $350. In a pre-election gesture, the government froze pharmacare premiums and the copay for a full 12 months at a cost of $10 million. My question then to the Minister of Health, Mr. Speaker, is the Minister prepared to commit here today that seniors in this province will not have any increase in participating in the Seniors Pharmacare program, either in the premium or the copay, for as long or as short a period of time that this government is in power?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to ensure that seniors in this province have one of the best pharmacare programs in Canada.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday, June 10th, 1998, the current Premier, former leader of the then Third Party, asked the exact same question of Health Minister Jim Smith. In fact, while in opposition, the current government was relentless in its attacks on the pharmacare program.
They wanted it free.
But, Mr. Speaker, the past is the past.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, next year the government's going to give up another $147 million in revenue, even though there is currently a deficit. So my question to the minister is the minister preparing to increase pharmacare premiums and copays for seniors in order to pay for the tax cut or to balance the budget?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, as I indicated, we're going to continue to have one of the best pharmacare programs in this country. And, Mr. Speaker, we as a government, in fact, acted to restore the property rebate program for senior citizens in this province, Mr. Speaker. That's how we're taking action. They cut and froze that program, Mr. Speaker, and we restored it.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Glace Bay in his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, the problem with that answer and with that government is that the whole reason of this government is being based on nothing more than a false premise. What they once demanded of government, they're not prepared to ask of themselves right now. This government claimed they balanced the budget. It came at the expense of seniors on pharmacare. It came at the expense of charities, the poor, the downtrodden, and it came at the expense of those who are languishing on waiting lists in this province, Mr. Speaker. And to add insult to injury, we now find out that that budget isn't even balanced, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the minister is, will the minister promise seniors in this province that they are not going to be called upon to sacrifice more to pay for the incompetence of his government?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Very difficult to answer a question based on a premise with which you disagree, but nevertheless I will try, Mr. Speaker. As a result of this government's efforts, Mr. Speaker, in ensuring that we have one of the best pharmacare programs in the country, thousands of seniors no longer pay yearly premiums, and that's a direct result of the actions of this government.
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. Mr. Speaker, on October 17th, the Metro Food Bank Society released figures from its Hunger Count 2003 report showing food bank usage in Nova Scotia increased by nearly 10% last year. And since 1997, food bank usage in Nova Scotia has dramatically increased by over 25%. This government has refused time and time again to admit its policies are leading to an increase in poverty in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Minister of Community Services, why has his government allowed more Nova Scotians to depend on food banks during its mandate?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, Mr. Speaker, I, as Minister of Community Services, I can speak to the perhaps on behalf of the clients that are on the Employment Support and Income Assistance Program. And Mr. Speaker, we know that there are 9,000 fewer clients on that program today, but we also know, Mr. Speaker, that basically the same amount of funding is going into the program. So with almost a 25% cut in the number of cases, but the same amount of funding, clearly a lot more is going into the average community service client's family. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, income assistance payments have gone down by 20% since 1971. And until 2001, this government clawed back the National Child Tax Benefit Supplement from families on social assistance. And the government ended the clawback with much fanfare, but nobody mentioned that at the same time, children's personal use allowances were cut from the assistance calculations, leaving families with even less money than when the clawback was in place. So my question, Mr. Speaker, through you to the minister, is how can this government justify taking money away from families who need it the most?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, you will not allow me enough time to properly answer that question. Suffice to say, though, Mr. Speaker, that when the number of clients in community services is cut by 25% and you maintain the same level of funding, that is like about a 1/3 increase in the amount that goes to each family on community services.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, a report by Dr. Lynn McIntyre shows that single mothers and their children are experiencing food insecurity in Nova Scotia. And instead of taking action, this government attempted to discredit the report. And my question, Mr. Speaker, to the minister is, the Hunger Count 2003 report supports the findings of Dr. Lynn McIntyre. So when will the department admit women and children are going hungry and take action?
Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Again, Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to this. And again, Mr. Speaker, I doubt if you would allow me to fully address the subjects that have been brought up. However, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that in a past government, when I was Minister of Community Service, it was pointed out that we are doing a review of the whole employment support and income assistance programs. One of the things would be the basic food rates involved in that, and we look forward to an outcome of that review. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to Minister responsible for Public Service Commission. Over the next year, the Public Service Commission will be acting as a provincial agent for the government in labour negotiations. Current Treasury and Policy Board is calling government departments to rein in their budgets. Unfortunately, for the government workers, the Deputy Minister of Treasury and Policy Board and the Public Service Commissioner are the same person, Vicky Harnish. Could the Minister explain to this House how she feels the Public Service Commission can bargain in good faith when the Public Service Commissioner and the Treasury Board Deputy are the same person?
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I don't believe there's a conflict there whatsoever. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your first supplementary.
Did we say conflict?
Order, please. Order, please. Honourable Member for Preston on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Treasury and Policy Board is directing cuts across government. How can employees believe they will receive better wages when the Public Service Commissioner is also the chief bean counter for the government?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
Well, again, I'm going to answer with the same response. I don't believe that this individual has a conflict whatsoever, and they are able to do that job. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Preston on your final supplementary.
The bottom line is employees are in for a rough ride because there is a conflict here.
Hear, hear.
What is the minister going to do to ensure the deck is not stacked against employees when the negotiations begin?
The Honourable Minister of Human Resources.
I can assure you that negotiating will happen in an open environment and that there will not be a problem when this happens. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, HRM residents have long used Long Lake Provincial Park as a place to walk their dogs off-leash. Because there are so few off-leash areas in the HRM, Long Lake Park, and especially the portion of it lying in my constituency, has become immensely popular with dog walkers. But a few weeks ago, the Department of Natural Resources decided to start enforcing the leash law after many years of not enforcing it.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview has the floor.
Speaker, one email I received spoke of armed DNR officers hiding in the bushes and jumping out to ticket dog walkers.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview has the floor. Order, please.
I'm really glad to see the members on that side of the House find it hilarious when somebody's out walking their dogs and they're confronted by an armed enforcement officer, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister, why has the department done an about-face on enforcement and turned Long Lake dog walkers into criminals?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the honourable member, Mr. Speaker, the regulations are for all parks, all provincial parks in our province, and that includes Long Lake.
Halifax Fairview on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the people who've contacted me do understand that the leash law is on the books. What they don't understand is why the department didn't enforce that law for 19 years and then without any public consultation whatsoever just woke up one morning and decided to start enforcing it. The park was designated in 1984, but there is still no park management plan. My question to the minister, why did the department not wait until after public consultation on the park management plan before it decided to exclude one particular kind of park user?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure that member's well aware that our department did give warnings to residents using the park with their dogs off leash, and it is for public safety why that regulation's in place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, if that's the case, maybe the minister could answer why his department didn't enforce the law for 19 years. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Natural Resources is the steward of a vast amount of park land and crown land in the HRM. Long Lake could potentially be designated as an off-leash area, but if not, another area in HRM could be so designated. So my question to the minister, what steps will the department take to work with dog owners to designate an off-leash area in the HRM?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the regulations are for all parks in our province. All provincial parks have regulations on them, and dogs must be on leashes, and it's for public safety, Mr. Speaker, and we will be enforcing that regulation.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Municipal Relations. According to the latest 2001 census releases, it indicates that since 1981, 11 counties experienced a population loss of 37,000 people, including 26,000 from the counties in Cape Breton. The new president of the UNSM, Mayor Morgan, has brought that forward, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister sit down with the UNSM and all the municipalities affected to begin finding a solution to rural depopulation?
The honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member brings forward a very important issue for Nova Scotia and for those municipalities that are seeing these types of decreases. And yes, I remain committed to working with the UNSM on issues that affect them, as I have in the past.
Thank you. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this issue cuts across party lines in government departments. Rural economic development has stopped because of it, and a prime example is the co-op down in Neils Harbour, where they have to bring in workers from Newfoundland in order to process the fish because of lack of population in the area. This is an issue that we can all sink our teeth into, Mr. Speaker. So I would like to ask the minister, is his department investigating the issue, and is the minister prepared to bring to the cabinet so that all departments can participate in a solution?
The honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our department is certainly aware of the issue, and we will be working with the affected municipalities to try to develop strategies to deal with it. And, Mr. Speaker, when we are able to bring those strategies forward, we will hopefully implement them and work towards a resolution so municipalities won't be sacrificed as a result of that problem, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, poorer municipalities will continue to need help from the province if the trend is not reversed. And it appears, the way things are going, that rural versus urban is alive and well. Depopulation is probably the single greatest impediment to economic growth in rural regions. So, Mr. Speaker, my final question to the ministers, can I get a commitment from the minister today to take a lead role in addressing this issue by starting a province-wide consultation process regarding rural depopulation?
The honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, what I will tell the member is that since being named Minister responsible for municipal affairs, I have begun a process of visiting all municipalities to identify through them what their issues and concerns with, and we will work with those municipalities to try to address those concerns the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you. The honourable member for Timberlea Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the growing community which I'm privileged to represent has been more than patient with this government's commitment to not only make Sir John A. Macdonald High School safe environmentally, but to deliver the promised addition of extra classrooms, a proper gymnasium, and other needed renovations. The Deputy Minister on a recent tour showed a woeful lack of awareness on the details of the proposed construction site, which is fenced off, ready for work, but ominously silent. So, Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister is, Mr. Minister, what are the current plans for the addition, and when can we expect some sod being turned?
The honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, that project is going ahead. I will try and get a date for the sod turning for the member before the end of the day.
Member for Timberlea Prospect on your first supplementary.
Thank you, and that's a commitment we've been waiting for, because as the principal has said to me in numerous times, we feel we've been nickeled and dimed through this process. These students have had to put up with split shift during 2 different school years at 2 different neighboring high schools. In a letter of September 4th, you stated, and I'll table this letter, the final phase of renovations will be completed by September of 2005. Mr. Minister, is that a reasonable time to have these students in this growing community to wait 2 more complete school years before they can be in a facility that delivers curriculum for the 21st century?
The honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, As the member knows, there are a number of capital projects scheduled in the province. The Sir John A. Macdonald project is in that schedule. What I think, and he would have to recognize this, that certainly there are some inconveniences that the students have experiences out there, but the most important thing is they have had access to quality education in other sites. Now, the honourable member would also remember is that when the department dealt with the problems of Sir John A. Macdonald, there was full community consultation, and I think by any measure the department and TPW officials in what was agreed to in not only the school, the site, went beyond that which was initially planned.
Member Timberley Prospect on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Minister, as a growing community, we'll accept nothing less than the high school with the resources, with the promises that was made by the previous Minister of Education in a truthful, upfront, many times, a truthful, upfront manner to me as the MLA and to the community. That was the previous MLA for Halifax Citadel. She was a straight shooter when it came to Mr. Minister, are you prepared to attend a tour of that high school with me and the principal at your earliest opportunity?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the opportunity to visit schools in any part of Nova Scotia, and if the honourable member would like to check with my office, we could arrange that. I would be quite pleased to do that.
As soon as the host rises.
Honourable Member for Hants East, you have about 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Go.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as much as people may not believe it, we may have dodged a bullet in Hurricane Juan. This was a hurricane that was an eye-opener and a wake-up call for Nova Scotians, and we were only lucky that that hurricane didn't do more damage. So, Mr. Speaker, I want the minister in charge of EMO.
Order, please. Time allotted for question period has expired. Order, please. We have several requests for introductions. The first one is the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to introduce to you and to members of the House in the Speaker's Gallery 3 Halifax Regional Municipality Councillors, Councillor Linda Mosher, Councillor Ron Cooper, and Councillor Len Gocher. If I could ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Certainly welcome our guests to the gallery today and hope they enjoy the proceedings. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I rose and explained that this week is Foster Family Appreciation Week in Nova Scotia. And I also mentioned the dedication that foster families show on a daily basis to helping all children enjoy the benefits of a loving family environment, and that Nova Scotia is fortunate to have more than 700 foster families across the province. Today, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to introduce a very special guest in your gallery. One foster mother, this is one amongst the 700 who care for Nova Scotia's children, will be celebrating, and it says 45 years here today, but I understand it's actually 47, as a foster parent in this province. Barbara Stevens, Barbara, if you would rise, has fostered over 550 foster children. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the members of the House for finishing the speech for me, because they really said it all by the way they jumped to their feet. Thank you very much.
We certainly welcome our special guest to the gallery today and congratulate her on quite an accomplishment on behalf of the members of the legislature. Thank you. Government business, Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, if you please call the order of business public bills for second reading.
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 20, the Workers' Compensation Act / Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Bill number 20. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to rise on this bill, Mr. Speaker, on the Bill number 20, entitled entitled An Act to Amend the Chapter 10 of the Acts of the 1994-95 Workers' Compensation Act and the Chapter 7 of the Acts of 1996 Occupational Health and Safety Act, Mr. Speaker.
Good job, Gordy.
The Supreme Court of Canada struck down the Nova Scotia legislation, Mr. Speaker, that barred compensation payments to workers suffering from chronic pain syndrome, Mr. Speaker. That was very good legislation, Mr. Speaker, that has been struck down, and I'm glad that it's done. Many workers receive temporary benefits for their injuries, but they're denied long-term payments when they continue to suffer chronic pain months and years later, and they can't go back to work, Mr. Speaker. I personally worked in the steel plant for many years, Mr. Speaker, and know of many men that were actually hurt on the job and suffered many injuries over the years, and stress at home, and what it's done to families, Mr. Speaker. And maybe I'll explain, Mr. Speaker, the legislation that the chronic pain syndrome is medically described as pain that persists for an unusual long time or can't be supported by more specific medical information concerning the injury, Mr. Speaker. Their suffering is real. There's a lot of men in my area, in my riding, Mr. Speaker, and their claims cannot be automatically just banned for all their pain and suffering, Mr. Speaker. These men are not malingerers, Mr. Speaker, so they are, you know, as they are often portrayed as somebody that's pretending to be hurt or somebody that's making it up. These are real injuries that are very severe, and they are men that worked hard in a lot of industries and construction and other industries that have been hurt and suffered. They suffer a lot in this. Many have fallen into poverty and depression over their injuries, Mr. Speaker, for not having any income and losing their homes and losing things that they've worked so hard for after many years of working. And even some of the injured workers, Mr. Speaker, have gone on to commit suicide over this, Mr. Speaker, for not being properly compensated for being severely hurt at work. So, you know, there are many workers that are unable to return to work due to the chronic pain following the workplace industry, Mr. Speaker, for long-term compensation, the lack of compensation. They are granted assistance for up to a year, Mr. Speaker, but once chronic pain is diagnosed, workers are given 4 weeks of therapy to help them deal with their, to deal with their pain and suffering, and the benefits are stopped. I mean, 4 weeks of therapy for somebody that's severely hurt in the job place, Mr. Speaker. I don't find that to be very fair to anybody in the industry today, Mr. Speaker. I personally know a few fellows at home, and I won't mention their names. I guess I'll say their first names of Jackie and Joe, I guess, that have been, one fellow's that had it over 13 years, Mr. Speaker, with the compensation board off and on about his injury and his pain and suffering. And I think it was last Thursday he was up before the board, and again, just waiting to hear back if he's going to be able to survive and keep his home and those, Mr. Speaker, one of the key reasons for the introduction of this bill at this time was the need to deal with the Supreme Court decision, Mr. Speaker. And I think that we have to look at the Dorsey report. You know, the Dorsey report was a consensus report produced by an 8-member committee following a review in the 2001 of Nova Scotia's worker compensation system. The committee was chaired by BC lawyer James Dorsey, Mr. Speaker. And we're just trying to figure out if the government is ever going to implement any of the regulations or any of the things that are in this report to the compensation. The report has been there now for over 2 years, and I don't know how many of the recommendations have ever been implemented, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the workers, you know. I just think that it's discrimination for many injured workers in this province, Mr. Speaker, for many, many years. These men have worked hard to build such a strong industry base, and worked hard on many, many construction jobs and other jobs around the province, Mr. Speaker, whether it be in farming or any other thing, and get seriously hurt, Mr. Speaker. And I think that it's been neglected for too long a time, Mr. Speaker. Workplace compensation also has the worst benefits and the highest premiums in the country here in this province, Mr. Speaker. Those are things that has to be changed. You know, there has to be some way that we can change those things to make it a better place for injured workers to live in, Mr. Speaker. Also, I was looking at some of my notes here, Mr. Speaker, and there are many men that I feel like their self-esteem and their the way they feel about themselves after going up and down before the compensation board and having monthly meetings and injured workers associations all across the province to try to get help for their injuries and to help them to cope, Mr. Speaker. It's very difficult when you're seriously injured and not bringing an income into your family to cope with the issues out there today with the way it is, the high expenses to live in this province today, Mr. Speaker. And I find that we have to do something as elected officials to help these people. And I'm very glad that the Supreme Court of Canada struck down this legislation, Mr. Speaker. I'm very, very happy about that. I think that workers are 4 weeks of therapy for a serious industry, Mr. Speaker. I think that's very unfair, you know, and when they're diagnosed with chronic pain. Very unfair to these workers, Mr. Speaker. And I do see a parallel here between the bill up in the legislature right now, Mr. Speaker, for the insurance bill with the cap on the $2,500. I do find that that's the soft tissue industry. There is some parallel between this being struck down and that bill that's before our legislation right now, Mr. Speaker. And I hope, fortunately, that we'll have to see what's going to happen with that bill and what's going to happen with these injured workers, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court has given us a mandate to come back, you know, to the workers of this province and come out and I hope that the regulations are going to be addressed by all the stakeholders, the workers, the government, and the opposition, and the government side of the House, and you know what I mean. The parallels, I guess. Oh boy. Many workers, Mr. Speaker, are still feeling and suffering pain today from injuries that they received on the jobs in the coal mines and the steel plants at home in Cape Breton, and suffering many injuries. And also, I have another good friend by the name of Jackie who has been suffering he was a pipe fitter and working with asbestos for many, many years, Mr. Speaker, and has been up in front of the Compensation Board for over 13 years. And speaking to him recently, Mr. Speaker, that now the disease that from the asbestos in the pipes and everything that he was working with has now spread into his other lung. And for many years he was fighting for compensation for one. Now it's spreading into his other lung, Mr. Speaker. So as time goes by, who can say if, you know what I mean, soft pain, tissue injuries and that are the same, I guess. And well, I just hope that, Mr. Speaker, that we can all get together in this House and work together as a team and all parties in this House to come together and put these regulations together for the injured workers so we can help them make better lives for them and their families, Mr. Speaker. It's very difficult today when you don't have an income coming in and you're constantly battling to pay the bills, Mr. Speaker. Like I had said there in the past, there's even been noticed some suicides of people and the hardships and the poverty that's been going on these people, Mr. Speaker. And I think that that's important that we as a legislature, Mr. Speaker, work with all the stakeholders. It's our job as legislatures, Mr. Speaker, to work with the stakeholders in this, the injured workers, the compensation board, as legislators to come up with some kind of resolve for this problem, Mr. Speaker. I personally know, like I said, some people that are seriously hurt, Mr. Speaker, and for many, many years have suffered. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate your time for this bill, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize the Alma member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise and make a number of interventions on Bill number 20. At the outset, Mr. Speaker, I must say I'm particularly pleased with the opportunity to review a number of the issues from the Dorsey report that are somehow connected to Bill number 20, albeit that there are a considerable number of recommendations that haven't even been addressed in this particular piece of legislation, and the fact that the government is by its own admission, allowing a considerable amount of the detail of this legislation to be carried out through regulation. Now, that having been said, Mr. Speaker, the the most interesting aspect of this particular piece of legislation is the issue dealing with chronic pain. Now, this, Mr. Speaker, as you could probably well remember, back in 1998 and 99, when the Select Committee of the Legislature, involving a large number of stakeholders from across this province, undertook to review the workers' compensation system and the act that we had before us at that time, until we came to a series of recommendations which were brought before this House, and albeit it was not unanimous, but I do feel that considerable progress was made at that time in improving the rights for injured workers of this province. I do believe that there was some clarity brought into the process that wasn't there before. I know the issue of chronic pain hadn't even been considered before Bill 90 was brought before the House. And in particular, Mr. Speaker, I think part of the premise upon which that particular piece of legislation was brought before this House of Assembly was based in part in the 1996 Supreme Court decision, albeit that it was a split decision of the Supreme Court. We had at least some type of a guide to carry us through on that particular piece of legislation. And what we witnessed less than 2 months ago was the Supreme Court coming down and essentially reversing its own decision. Now, I know there are a number of other factors and issues that are related to that, but that's effectively what happened. So, thereby, an opportunity for all members of the legislature to fine-tune and perhaps strengthen the issue of chronic pain for all those injured workers that have been lost through the cracks, or somehow have been treated unfairly through the workers' compensation system, that including the Workers' Advisors Program, the internal review process within the board, and indeed at WCAT, or is what we refer to as the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal. But, Mr. Speaker, I think it's ill-advised to suggest that there was some form of collusion to inhibit the rights and the privileges of injured workers in this province, which was suggested in large measure by the Leader of the Opposition in last evening's presentation when he spoke. I think nothing can be further from the truth. And I think it's ill-advised, and I think it doesn't do any justice for the injured workers. I don't think it does any justice for the working men and women across this province, and it doesn't do anything for the industries of this province. Now, what I find a little bit concerning, Mr. Speaker, is the lack of detail on some of the issues. And I certainly want to acknowledge the fact that the minister was very forthcoming and very accommodating in suggesting that all three parties have an opportunity to articulate the regulations on the issue of chronic pain and a number of other supplemental issues. But equally so is the concern that perhaps some of these issues that he prefers in regulation should in fact be put in legislation. And that's one of the good things about this process. We'll have an opportunity not only here at the second reading, but more importantly at law amendments, where various groups, the injured workers groups from across the province, the employers, and various stakeholders from all different perspectives will have an opportunity to come in, and they can make certain recommendations. Now, there are two perspectives that I would like to focus on, Mr. Speaker, at this point. Number one is the employees, the working men and women in this province that work every day and are of the opinion that they go to their place of work in the thoughts and in the hopes that they will be working in a rather secure, safe working environment. Now that's should be the same whether it be in public service, the private sector, whether it be in the resource industry, whether it be in the high-tech industry, or what have you. And for each one of these sectors of the economy, Mr. Speaker, the rights of the workers somehow seem to vary. And not that that's contemplated by design, but there are still, in my view, a number of weaknesses within the Occupational Health and Safety Act that could certainly be firmed up so that the average Nova Scotian worker can be afforded the rights and privileges and the protections that this particular piece of legislation was designed for. And we all know, Mr. Speaker, a lot of this came as a result of what happened in that tragedy, the West Ray mine in Pictou County. And I've noticed...
Order, please. Member Cape Breton West has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I noticed some substantial improvements in the workplace because of the adoption of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But, Mr. Speaker, we have in this process over the last 4 years, the fact that the government has brought in this sunset clause on regulations. And in large measure, many of the regulations that were in place at that point in time are not there today that afforded the rights and the protections for injured workers and for all workers in this province. And I believe in certain measure the government caved into big business. And nothing was more clear of that when they changed the regulations requiring just one lineman that would be going out on a job description with Nova Scotia Power, now possible, whereas previous to this administration and previous to, I believe it was 2001, it was a requirement there had to be 2 linemen going out on job calls in emergency situations. So clearly, there was considerable evidence that was brought forth that would suggest that senior officials, or at least one senior official from Nova Scotia Power, had come into the minister's office, lobbied through the back door, as it was, and bypassed the Occupational Health and Safety Panel. And even against the recommendations of that particular body, Mr. Speaker, the government sided on the side of Nova Scotia Power. Now, what was the benefit of that? Obviously, when you cut through all the arguments on both sides of the issue, it was all about money. Nova Scotia Power wanted to reduce its overhead cost. And I believe in some measure that perhaps the issue of safety was sacrificed. Now, only time will tell how critical an issue that will become. But that's just one small example of what can happen, Mr. Speaker, when we adopt a piece of legislation, the spirit and the intent is there, and then all of a sudden, government starts to tinker and starts to tamper with what was put in perspective. So, Mr. Speaker, I wanted to put that on the table because we have approximately 30,000 small businesses throughout Nova Scotia. Now, out of the 30,000 businesses in Nova Scotia, they represent approximately 70% of the labor force. And for the most part, many of those industries may be unionized. They may have fairly good occupational health and safety working committees, advisory bodies, which are required, a prescription of law, in the workplace. If you have 25 employees or more, then obviously that's a routine measure, and the reports have to be kept on file, and everybody has to be in agreement or at least there has to be some consensus, and recording of the differences of opinion as well. So at least when an occupational health and safety officer goes in and does an on-site inspection or an audit, unannounced audit of the working conditions and the environment that the workers are compelled to work in, they'll get a truer picture of what's happening there. Unlike what used to happen in years past, where Company A would somehow, for whatever reason, be given the heads up that a government inspector would be arriving on the job scene on a certain day. And there were suggestions of that at the Westray coal mine, that they knew in advance when a certain inspector would be showing up from the Department of Labor. So it defeats the whole purpose and the spirit of the legislation. So these issues do impact on the workers' compensation system and the ability for workers to work in a safe and good working environment. Now, with that, obviously, what's the flip side? If someone goes to the workplace and they're injured, well, you would expect that the workers' compensation system would be there as a safety net to provide them fair and just compensation. Mr. Speaker, when I was Minister of Labor, I know very well that I had inherited a number of issues in a system and a piece of legislation that was far from perfect. What we adopted, was it perfect? No, it wasn't perfect. But was it an improvement over what it was? I think even the injured workers would have to say that it was a step forward. Because every step that you take towards clarifying all the rules of engagement, the issue of chronic pain wasn't even on the table prior to 1999. It was there, it was discussed, it was debated. The injured workers argued, their workers' advisors and their lawyers, they argued in favor of trying to get some justice and somehow have this rolled into the legal process and the legislative process. But for those who never heard of that word before or the implications, whether it be near or broad-based, Mr. Speaker, it's quite an adjustment, and I think all stakeholders would have to agree. And the issue of chronic pain, as the minister, by his own admission during the press conference that he held when he indicated he was tabling his bill, the cost implications of chronic pain alone, this one issue alone, and I believe he may have overstated the issue, he may have understated, I don't know. But the suggestion that it would cost an additional $118 or $119 million is an issue that we all have to deal with. Because if the money is not there, how do we pay the injured workers? We can change the legislation, and we do have to do that, whether we like it or not. That's an order of the Supreme Court of Canada. But where's the money going to come from? I would submit that perhaps the actuaries from the Workers' Compensation Board should be required to come before law amendments and give a detailed breakdown, not this hide and seek and the constant changing variables that we all experienced back in 1998-99, but as well through the Dorsey report, he expressed considerable concern, and I believe it may have been on page 47 of that report, that he expressed concern about the validity of the figures that were being provided by the actuaries at the Workers' Compensation Office. So, Mr. Speaker, is that $118 million, is that a genuine figure? Is that as close and as accurate an estimate that could be put forth? Is it 200 million or is it 50 million? See, these are the things that even I as a legislator and even I as a former minister, I had problems with, because every time we turned around to cost estimate something, it seemed like we were dealing with different figures. And it doesn't reflect well on anybody in this legislature when you're dealing with those type of variables. One thing I must say that I was particularly pleased with, and it was a particular benefit to the injured workers and to industry in this province. Back in the latter part of August, I believe it was, in 1999 or 1998, I made a suggestion that all non-Nova Scotia firms start paying its fair share of workers' compensation premiums, same as Nova Scotia firms. And for those who are new to the legislature or not familiar with what I'm referring to, up until 1999, any firm from outside Nova Scotia did not have to pay workers' compensation premiums for up to 6 months when they would come into Nova Scotia and do business. And in many cases, some of these companies that would have large contracts, construction contracts, whether it be building a superhighway or a large office complex or condominium outlets or whatever, what they would do is they would stay for 5 months and 29 days, then send all their workers home and send in another batch of workers, or at least the same workers under a different holding company. So then the meter would start all over for them. Exactly, subcontracting. And who were the workers? It was the Nova Scotia workers, it was the construction workers of this province that were the big losers. Now, I was quite pleased that the Conservative caucus supported that initiative. The NDP caucus did not. And I was disappointed at that, quite frankly. And that was on the front page of the Chronicle Herald at that time. And I was absolutely perplexed as to why the leader of the NDP at the time, Robert Chisholm, member for Halifax Citadel, rejected that outright. He was very suspicious. Yes, Atlantic, I'm sorry. I do apologize. The symmetry between the two constituencies and what we were receiving at the time was not much different. But we're very hopeful. We're very hopeful with the new member for Halifax Atlantic. But that was a very important issue, because at the end of the day, Nova Scotia workers' compensation system, and indeed injured workers, we were able to generate upwards, after expenses, in excess of, I would say, $12 million in the first year, just in the first year. Now that went a long ways towards dealing with some of the cost of chronic pain and the other issues that were before us, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West allow for an introduction?
Yes.
The Honourable Minister of Tourism and Culture on introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it gives me pleasure to draw everybody's attention, members of the House, to the Speaker's Gallery, and to indicate that we have in the gallery with us here today a NASCAD, group of students from NASCAD, Senior Seminar Ornamenting Space Seminar, I guess I have that correct, and Dr. Marie Elwood is doing instructing on the seminar portion, I believe, and the instructor is Dr. Sandra Alfaldy. And I should mention, Mr. Speaker, Dr. Marie Elwood was an ONS, correct, Order of Nova Scotia recipient last year as well. Madam Speaker, welcome to the chair. And I would ask everyone to give them a warm welcome here to the House of Assembly.
The Honourable Member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so on that issue, we felt that that was a tremendous boost for the injured workers in Nova Scotia, indeed for the average working Nova Scotian. That generated additional revenues, put the Nova Scotia companies on an even playing field with the non-Nova Scotia companies, and it not only that, but it leveled the playing field for all the different construction workers in this province, whether it be electricians, pipe fitters, plumbers, carpenters, you have it, Mr. Speaker. They wouldn't have to be caught out on the street picketing, looking for an opportunity to gain access to a particular job or contract because of the uneven playing field, because of that cost of workers' compensation. Now, there was an interesting thing that happened, Madam Speaker. during the formulation of Bill number 90. And it all surrounds the issue of occupational health and safety training and who is going to absorb the cost of that. And again, for those who aren't familiar with the process, within the Department of Labor, now Environment and Labor, there's an occupational health and safety division. And the total cost of that division within the department would be approximately anywhere from $3.6 to $4 million a year. And that money would be paid for by the employers of the province. And by an order of cabinet, that money would be issued from the Workers' Compensation Board over to the Department of Labor. And that would be part of the budgetary process to operate occupational health and safety. That would be like for education, training, inspection, enforcement, and what have you. Now, when Bill 90 was before the House of Assembly, the Conservative caucus at that time said, this is totally and patently unfair that 40% of all the employers in the province is paying 100% of the cost of occupational health and safety. Because out of the 30,000 industries in Nova Scotia, 40% pay into the system, and they cover about 70% of all the employees. Now, the Conservative caucus at that time made a rather passionate plea that that should be split between the employers who pay into the workers' compensation system and the taxpayers of Nova Scotia. And they come up with a formula of 85%, 15%. 85% paid by the employers of the province would cover the cost of occupational health and safety, and 15% would be from the general revenues of the province, that is, the taxpayers. Well, because they felt that 40% shouldn't be paying 100% of the cost. So let's go with that argument. But soon as they got from this side of the House, Madam Speaker, to that side of the House, what did they do? They changed that, and they shoved it back up to 91% on the backs of the employers of this province. And I'm not so sure how many of the employers really have been fully apprised of what was happening there. Well, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, there's another facet to this entire issue of occupational health and safety. There are certain sectors of the economy who pay their own occupational health and safety training programs over and above the cost of the occupational health and safety cost that they pay to this occupational health and safety division within the Department of Labor. And for those who aren't familiar, let me explain. There are certain sectors of the economy, such as the construction industry, the trucking industry, and perhaps a number of others. They, by cabinet order, that body, they would go as a body to the government and say, we want X number of dollars that we pay into the workers' compensation system to be paid to the Nova Scotia Construction Safety Association to ensure that all our workers meet a minimum standard of training. Now, that's over and above what these same employers pay to the Occupational Health and Safety Division of Department of Labor. So they're paying twice. Now, on the other hand, we have others that don't pay anything. We have 60% of the industry paying nothing. So somewheres in there has to be a balance. Now, the government has suggested through its legislation, let's move towards universal coverage. Will that solve the problem? I say no. I say no because there are so many of the small mom-and-pop businesses with just like the husband and the wife and maybe one child in the family, maybe just themselves running a small corner store or a craft shop, and they're borderline. They're borderline as to whether they're even able to make it. I don't know all the details, but I would submit, Madam Speaker, that the minister should put this detail before all members of the House so that we can make a comprehensive and a fair-minded, rational decision as to whether it should be universal or not. If the government wants to do anything, they should follow our lead. Just shortly before, and it was only probably a month or 2 months before the provincial election, we had the cabinet order prepared, and it was generally agreed what was the next sector that should be covered after we got the non-Nova Scotia firms? The banking industry. The banking industry, how many millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars are taken out of this province every day? How many hundreds of millions of dollars are profited by these companies? And yes, they'll use the argument about their own insurance plans and so on and so forth. But, Madam Speaker, rather than get into the details of those arguments, I would submit that they were all dealt with at that particular point in time, and there's little or no reason to suggest why we shouldn't be focusing on that sector of the economy. That would yield at least another $5 million after expenses. And that's giving consideration to all the potential injuries that would happen, all the, taking the actuarials and looking at the revenues coming in and the potential, the size of the employment, the labor pool versus the number of people that would generally be injured within that sector of the economy. And it would still be a win-win situation for everybody, Madam Speaker. So that's why I'm concerned about going overboard. There has to be a balance. There has to be a balance for these small mom and pop businesses that are just borderline. Many of them are forced to compete with the Sobeys and the Loblaws and the superstores, all these, Madam Speaker, and the cost of operation is just insurmountable. The cost of property taxes, business occupancy tax. And at the rate we're going, I don't know, where's the cutoff? There has to be a balance. It would be nice to have everything in there, like the violence in the workplace regulations. I think we should have them. But there has to be some balance as to what extent. You know, we have different points of view. If you look at from organized labor's point of view, they have some very compelling arguments. But if you look at from the small business community point of view, the cost of that could probably drive up the cost of their business another 5%. You know, just on that one issue alone. The cost of implementing that one factor alone is somewhere estimated to be $14 or $15 million. Just that one issue. So it doesn't take long. It doesn't take long for us to have to make some value judgments on some very serious issues. On the issue of Sunday shopping, there are a lot of proposals put forth about let's say, suggestion about going to 3 vacation weeks after 8 years of employment, as opposed to presently 2, to the additional 3 days of sick time for parents with, that may have a sick child or so on. And these are all legitimate arguments. But just stand back and watch as they all add up. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't approve any of them. What I'm saying is somehow we have to, as politicians, as legislators, make sure that we have everything out there and as much as possible so all the stakeholders can see what's coming before them. Because now we have the chronic pain issue. They say it's $180 million. I don't know how valid that figure is. There was the other issue about going on the pension, bringing it up from 50 to 55% for the indexing. So that's another $11 million. I don't know. We don't tax the system to the point where what we do is we start punishing the injured workers more than they've already been punished. That's what I'm saying. And they've been punished enough. So at some point in time, Madam Speaker, I think it would be nice if the Minister of Environment and Labour put all these issues on the table and stop doing them on a piecemeal basis. And then we're always scrambling, looking over our shoulders, saying, well, what just happened? You know, what are the cost implications to industry, to the private sector, to the public sector? All these things. If we take, let's say if we wanted to, I'm going to hypothesize, if we wanted to go strictly and make sure that the issue of chronic pain is dealt with. Now, if it's going to be dealt with as is proposed or suggested by the Supreme Court of Canada, and it has to be in some large measure, okay, what are the options? Number one, we raise rates. Number two, we broaden the assessment base. Number three, it could be a combination of any two. Or number four would be cut back on the benefits. Well, you can't do that. You can't do that. That option is off the table. So you have any one of those other three options. So what is the government going to do, and what are we as opposition politicians going to do? Because, let's be realistic, this is a minority government. And how much are we prepared to give, and how much are we prepared to ask certain sectors of the economy to pay? Quite frankly, I'm not so sure we have enough detail at this point. I believe the Workers' Compensation Board, the officials, the CEO, some of the people, the experts at the board should come down with the actuarials and submit themselves to a detailed analysis so that we know that we're not giving away something that we can't afford. And at the end of the day, if the system collapses, then nobody wins. Nobody wins. And that's what happened back in 1993-94. Some pretty tough decisions were made. And many would argue that the biggest loser there were the injured workers. But on the other hand, if the system had collapsed, which was the suggestion at the day, I believe the unfunded liability at that time was $675 million. It may have been a little higher. Could 678 or 680 something, yes. And now it's down to about $287 million. I may have used the word thousand, but it's million. But Madam Speaker, what do we do? What do we do? We now have some of the highest rates in the country. And, you know, we're going through a transformation here in Nova Scotia. The economy of scales are changing quite dramatically. Rural Nova Scotia is being depopulated at a considerable rate that is having an impact on the small businesses. Well, that's true. That's true. There's not a rural economic development strategy that would help to compensate for this urbanization of Nova Scotia, to build a strong capital core. And if we don't do something, it'll be not just the schools and the fire departments and all the community halls that'll be closing down. The communities themselves, in essence, will be closing down. And perhaps maybe we should be looking at some of these economic development strategies like they used to do back in the 70s, where the Department of Economic Development would provide an incentive for small businesses Madam Speaker, this is not comedy hour. The member from Dartmouth North wants me to go and talk to him about economic development. I ran my own business since I was 16 years of age, and I paid my own bills, and I made sure that the workers that I employed were well protected, and there were no complaints. So I'm very satisfied in taking as much my advice on my experience than I am from the member from Dartmouth North.
Excuse me. Order. Would the honourable member agree to a short introduction?
Yes, Madam
Thank
Speaker.
you. The honourable member from Kings North.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate that, honourable member, and appreciate the fact that I'm not sitting in my right seat. But the students I want to introduce are in the gallery behind me, in the West Gallery. And I'd like to be able to have eye contact with them when I introduce them. They're from the Horton High School, which is actually, although the catchment area includes Port Williams area, which is part of my riding, the school's actually located, as you know, in Kings South. But I'd like them to rise. Nancy McLeod is the teacher, and Nancy's here, and they speak fluent French, all of them. And they're... Yeah, well, je ne parle pas le français, je parle espagnol, est-ce que je dis. And they're here with the parents. Mr. McLeod is here, and Ms. Henniger, and who else? I'm missing two parents, but my notes are at the back there.
Mr. St. George.
Ah, well, welcome. Anyway, if I'd ask them to rise, I've told them they were hoping to come here for question period, but the timing of the House is a bit different today. So please give them a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, and back to our member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I was saying, the issue of ensuring that the system is fairly solid for the workers of this province is of paramount concern. I'm not sure if we have received sufficient detail from the government on the other 60% of the industries and the businesses in this province have been completely examined, so that we know that we can indeed provide sufficient coverage that would ensure additional revenues in a fair and equitable fashion without squeezing the small private business, you know, the mom and pop type businesses out of business altogether, because that's more prevalent through rural Nova Scotia than it is in urban Nova Scotia, those types of operations, because they're an integral part to the economy of scales. Madam Speaker, one of the issues that we also have to be very mindful of on the issue of occupational health and safety. I know the proposal by the government is to move the education and training process over to the Workers' Compensation Board. And I believe some of that, from a practical point of view, from an administrative point of view, has already happened, because the government had it in its budget earlier in the year, and that was part of its promise on Blue Book 1, in Blue Book 1, if we could refer to that. That was their blueprint back in the 1998 or 1999 election platform. It'll be interesting to see how the dollars will follow. What percentage of the budget will follow? Should that be done through an OIC, or should that be something that should be identified clearly through legislation, through a section of the legislation? Madam Speaker, the enforcement side of the Department of Labor is one that I believe that has to be maintained at a high level of independence. There's been growing concern in the labor community that perhaps the government is going soft on industry when it comes to the enforcement of certain infractions. I don't have all the detail. It would certainly be an opportunity for the minister to bring those types of issues before this House, and I would hope that he would be very quick to do that. I'm a little bit concerned about the proposal by the government to eliminate the Medical Review Commission, which is already enshrined in Bill 90 and the previous legislation to that. Well, the proposal by the government is to do away with the Medical Review Commission and to have an appointed commissioner. Well, Madam Speaker, I think that is patently unfair. And any suggestion by the government that perhaps either the medical society are not particularly keen on becoming involved, or the fact that it really hasn't been functional to the point where it's been effective, I don't buy that argument either. The reality is, Madam Speaker, it wasn't until 1998-99 when I discovered that issue was there in legislation, and it was an opportunity for an injured worker to get some justice at the Workers' Compensation Board. And what I speak in reference to there is the fact that in many occasions, physicians of the board were overruling the specialist, the opinions of the specialist. And that created so much unnecessary cost and agony and misery and frustration and anything that you can think of that would not be a positive. That's what this issue did. So I spoke with my deputy at the time and senior officials within the department, as well as consulting with the various stakeholders. And we came to the conclusion that we should activate the Medical Review Commission. And we allowed the Nova Scotia Medical Society to determine which 3 specialists that they would have. Now, they, could be 3 different specialists depending upon the issue or what, but effectively activate this commission so that if there was an issue of impasse between the board, the physicians of the board and the specialists, then there could be an option whereby the injured worker could have his or her medical evidence taken and examined to see the measure of the evidence and perhaps to lend some weighted evidence as to whether, in fact, there was a cause and effect relationship. Now, of course, the election came and left. We just got it up and running. And what happened? The Conservative government killed it. They put it in a waste paper basket before it even got up and into full gear. They didn't want the injured workers of this province to be treated fairly before the board. What else did they do, Madam Speaker? You recall the ADR program, the alternate dispute resolution? Very, very effective. It had over a 60% success rate in the first year and close to a 75% success rate in the second year. And what did this government do? Within months of being elected, it shut it down. And the Minister of Justice, who was responsible for the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, said, oh, we don't need it. Everything is working fine. The Minister of Justice that we now have was the Minister of Justice of the day. So there are 2 issues right there, Madam Speaker, where this government turned its back on the injured workers of this province. And not a whimper. Now, when they were on this side, Madam Speaker, every day, that minister, when he was the critic for the workers' compensation system in the Conservative caucus, he was up on his feet every day, championing the cause of the injured workers. When he got on that side, and I'll give you a real classic example, Madam Speaker, because the speaker previous to myself, who represents Cape Breton Nova, made reference to injured workers and those that worked at Sydney Steel and so on. I believe there were approximately, and I do stand to be corrected on the number, but I believe it was somewhere in the vicinity of either 24 or 34 cases for injured workers that had applied to go into the ADR program, the Alternate Dispute Resolution Program, whereby the employer and the employee, the injured worker, would go before this informal panel at the workers' compensation system, and then they would, essentially thrash out their differences and present their arguments, the pros and cons of the arguments of the issue, whether the injured worker was really injured as severely as he or she said they were, or whether they were on the job, whether they weren't on the job, and everybody put everything on the table. No bars held. And at the end of the day, whatever was decided by the appeals tribunal, it was not binding It was not binding if either party decided to pull out. There was a window of opportunity. So it wasn't like it was, let's go in there and they were walked into a trap, the employers. No, it was there, and it was an excellent opportunity. And the success rate that was agreeable to both parties was just astounding. What did the government do as soon as it got elected? Shut that down. They shut every one of those cases that were pending before the ADR program. They shut them all down and told all those injured steelworkers, you go back in the mix, go fend for yourself. And what did that do? That drove up the cost to the employers of this province. Do you know why? Because the cost of the workers' advisor, the cost in some cases of going out and getting additional medical evidence, specialists, medical reports, the delayed time, all these factors, Madam Speaker, I would submit at the end of the day cost the employers of this province more in premiums. So just because there was a neoconservative philosophy about business versus labor, there's 3 specific examples where this government said one thing on this side of the House, got over there, and turned its back on the injured workers of this province. And indeed, industry, because they may have thought that they were doing industry a favor, but they didn't at the end of the day. They just drove the cost up. And that's what happened, Madam Speaker, from the early 70s right through until the last day that the John Buchanan, Donnie Cameron administration left office. The administration after that tried to bail the system out of bankruptcy. $3.6. Yes, Madam Speaker. Intervention. Look.
The honourable member from Community Services. Point of order?
Yeah.
Point of order.
Yes, the honourable member was having trouble hearing my helpful intervention, which was that the previous Liberal government added $3.6 billion to the province's debt, which represents in 6 short years almost a third of what the province owes in its entirety. Thank you.
It's not a point of order, but it's a piece of information. Thank you very much. Back to the honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. If the newfound economist could only take out his calculator, he'd find that the majority of that was interest charges because of the debt that was driven up by that previous Tory administration under John Buchanan. And that's the reality of it. And he can bury his head in the sand as much like an ostrich as he wants. But they are the facts, Madam Speaker. And the unfunded liability with the workers' compensation system has nothing to do with the debt there, although the taxpayers had to, in part, bail them out because of the antics of that previous administration. And by the Auditor General's account, the board, the workers' compensation system, was on the verge of bankruptcy. So how he can stand up and be so smug. Well, Madam Speaker, I'm not going to be sidetracked too much with rabbit tracks, because any government that would go and borrow $118 million to give out $155 checks and then the 10% tax cut and say that that's a balanced budget, if you spend $118 million more than you take in, that is not balanced. That's not balanced. He knows about imbalance. That's right. They're further to the right of us than we thought. But, Madam Speaker, the workers' compensation system is this is an excellent opportunity for all members to examine some of the issues surrounding the Dorsey report, some that are of housekeeping in nature, some of critical financial measure, and to what extent we'll be able to address them, I don't know. Maybe there are some issues of administration at the Workers' Compensation Board. There's been considerable consternation as of late about the polarization between the chair, the board of directors, and the CEO, which in effect, I understand, he was, well, he went on a sabbatical of some sort, or educational sabbatical, but this was after the board had given him notice that his job was being terminated. So now they can't terminate him. They can't hire a new CEO. I mean, the polarization down there is just absolutely mind-boggling, because you have that type of inconsistency and polarization at a senior administrative level. How would you expect the function of the board to be 100% in harmony or unison, or develop the symmetry of progress that we would expect? I do want to acknowledge and support the idea of the Workers' Compensation Board of Directors having one public meeting, at least one public meeting, annually for all stakeholders to attend, and hopefully there'd be an opportunity for some interaction there rather than just to come in and as a quiet bystander. Should be an opportunity to raise some concerns, just like a shareholder at a, you know, at a meeting for a local cooperative or something like that there, where you can hold your board of directors accountable. I believe that these issues are of critical importance, obviously, to the injured workers of this province. Madam Speaker, I would respectfully submit that perhaps there should be a greater collaboration on the process of appointments in some of these ABCs within the Department of Labor. The single interest groups that sometimes can be a driving force dominating public policy is not good for this province. Now, I don't want to dwell too deep into the issue per se, but I recall when I was minister at one point going into my office, and there was one representative, the Labor Relations Board was having a meeting, and one chap arrives going into a quasi-judicial board hearing as an arbitrator with a political button on in a government department. Well, is that any way to run a government office? I don't think so. It's not acceptable in this House, and it shouldn't be acceptable in any department. But that's how askew some of the issues were going within that particular department at that point in time, Madam Speaker. Another issue as well, you know, if the government really wants to do something substantive, look at the Labor Standards Division. There's a backlog of almost 22 months there. We don't have to change the legislation. We don't have to rewrite the laws of this province. Maybe there are some administrative tinkerings that can be done to ensure proper process, or give certain authorities to certain experts within a reasonable period of time, within the limitations. I don't pretend to know all the legal terminologies and reference points, but I think it's clearly understood, Madam Speaker, that 22 months for someone to have his or her case heard before that tribunal is absolutely unacceptable. And simply, the first step would be to go and hire some more employees and get the job done. And that would be a saving to the employers and to the employees of this province. 5 minutes? Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the suggestion has been made, it's much less than 22 months, but it would depend on the particular case. And I can only speak from my experience on representing certain individuals before that tribunal.
The honourable member allow for another short interruption for another introduction.
Yes, Madam
Thank
Speaker.
you.
Yes, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. And the honourable member from Kings West on an introduction.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague from Cape Breton West for allowing interruption in his speaking. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a group from Kings West, a group from Berwick Elementary and District School, and with them the 16 students that are here are in a French class, so I would have liked to be able to introduce them bilingually here, but a couple of my colleagues are not in the house here today. But I do give them a warm welcome. Also the parents with them, Pat Bonner, Ida McCullough, and teacher Joanne Richardson Landry, who also happens to be the wife of Liberal candidate Mike Landry in the last provincial election. So I'd like to give them all a warm welcome to the House and hope you'll enjoy your visit.
Back to the honourable member from Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I know that there'll be a considerable amount of time available, certainly at law amendments, for presenters to come and make suggestions to either amend, improve, reject any provision or all provisions of this bill as he, she, or they see fit. But we'll also have considerable amount of time. We'll have 20 hours of debate during Committee of the Whole, which I'm sure there will be some opportunity to bring forth amendments. And I would encourage all members of the House, irrespective of their political stripes, to take advantage of the Minister's invitation to participate in all party deliberations in the articulation of the regulations. Now, if there are certain issues that we prefer not to be in regulation, that's fine. Let's bring them before the committee, and the majority will. I'm sure that things will sort that issue out as it unfolds. But there's more to be gained by cooperating on this particular piece of legislation, much as what happened back in 1999. Was it perfect? No, it was not, Madam Speaker. Was it an improvement from what was there before? Yes, it was. And I believe even at that time, there were even members of the NDP caucus who made that suggestion, although that their voices were somewhat muzzled under the force of political pressure. But that's fine. That's fine. That's part of the democratic process. And but the majority saw fit to move ahead with that. I'm a little surprised with the complete turn of events with the Supreme Court of Canada, because it's completely reversed its position from 1996. Now, how were we as legislators to interpret as to what we're supposed to do when we have a driving force, the Supreme Court of Canada, in effect determining what the laws are before we even bring them before the legislatures or indeed the Parliament of Canada? Now, something is amiss, Madam Speaker. I don't know all the answers, but it's certainly one issue that I'll be looking into with further deliberation and concern on a future day. And I do thank you for the opportunity to speak on this particular bill. Thank you.
The honourable member from Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker. Before I get going, I'd like to welcome the guests in the gallery. I was a teacher for 15 years, and it's really nice to see students come to the House of Assembly. Not a place that I frequented much before I got elected in 1998, and today we've had 3 groups from the Valley, so I have to start encouraging teachers in my own area to bring students around. Well, excuse me, I'll take this opportunity to remove my muzzle, as the honourable member from Cape Breton West has referred to. I remember the debate on Bill 90. I was a new member to this House in 1998. That's when that bill went through the House. And I want to tell you, Madam Speaker, that being green as grass, I found trying to get my head around the workers' compensation legislation to be a particularly difficult performance. And I'm not entirely sure that I ever quite mastered it. Luckily, 2 of my colleagues here, and actually I should say more than that, because with 4 lawyers in the caucus, we certainly had people to rely on, but one of those was somebody says too many. One of those was had worked with the Workers Advisory Program and was a big help. One of the reasons I found that process so frustrating, because I couldn't believe that in a democratic society that we actually treated people this way. That there were injured workers in this province that we would put out on a limb and then cut the limb off. That we were willing to say, you don't exist. So the fact that you can't provide for your family because you got up and went to work one day is irrelevant. All your hopes, all your dreams, all your aspirations for the future and for your family's future, we were willing to write those off, or at least the government of the day was. Now, getting that bill through the House, that was an education in itself. Because I remember the honourable member from Cape Breton West was the Minister of Labour. He brought that bill to this legislature. And I remember him voting against his own amendments. So when it was for rookies like myself to try to get my head around what was going on, it was particularly difficult when the minister of the department couldn't get his head around his own piece of legislation. Now, when we get up in the morning and head off to work, as thousands of people do every day in this province, they don't have a sticker on their back that says worker. They are people who have their own hopes and dreams for what that work will do for them and their family. Now, my parents were not particularly well-to-do. Both worked. My father was a parking lot attendant at the airport, and my mother worked as a cashier at Cara Restaurant at the airport. So both of them got work because of the airport. Now, not high-paying jobs. Raised 6 kids, and I think they had their priorities pretty much in order. But the thought that they could get up one morning and go to work, or one evening, because in my father's case it was quite a bit of shift work, and be hurt and be injured at work and not be fairly compensated for that seems to me to be amazingly unjust. So I often thought, during this process of Bill 90, was where do the members of the Liberal Party who brought this legislation to the House, where do they live? Do they fly off to the moon at night? They don't even live on this planet. That they don't have the same concerns about themselves and their families and their relatives and anybody they know, the neighbor down the road who goes to work in the morning, and what the impact of this legislation might be for them? I could never understand that. It seemed to be that they totally were living outside of the world that the rest of us lived in. The honourable member for Cape Breton West is right about the unfunded liability. This was an exercise in futility carried out by the John Buchanan government, trying to keep the rates artificially low for businesses. So, I guess in his philosophy was, if you keep them low, you'll attract business. I don't know if there's any place on the earth that actually has been proven to be true, but what it meant was you had to take money from education and other areas where you would develop skilled workers which actually would attract businesses. I mean, these are the things that attract business to your area. It's not tax breaks and grants and whatever. It's a skilled workforce, good health care. Those are the things that attract businesses into the area. So actually the taxpayers were on the hook for the unfunded liability and had to cough that up. Now, the Supreme Court has made a decision, and the previous speaker had, just in his closing remarks, had made the comment that, the Supreme Court had changed its mind from previous decisions, and how was anybody supposed to be able to figure out what the Supreme Court is going to do, and therefore, they probably weren't wrong in the legislation that they drafted previously. Well, I'll tell you how you do that, Madam Speaker. First of all, you could look at the Charter of Rights. That'd be one way that you could look at what's coming over the horizon and say, do we actually have the right to do this? I remember that legislation, and they were going to take the right to sue away from people. So not only were they going to give you nothing, they weren't even going to let you have the right to go to court to sue for compensation. And I gotta say, if my memory is correct, I think at that time the Tories supported us in stopping that. Or maybe not. I'm just going by my memory. So, now chronic pain, the way I understand it, and whatever the book definition might be, but my way to describe chronic pain is to say this is an injury that you can't find evidence of after a period. If you x-ray the person, it's nothing. Basically soft tissue injury. So it makes it really difficult for people with chronic pain to make a case. Because when they're examined by the best technology, you can't find anything. So it's really their word against somebody else's word. Now, the previous speaker, the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West, raised a good point of the board overruling specialists. Well, I had heard of that happening. I always thought it was a bit bizarre since the members on the board weren't doctors. So, but I often wondered why the government allowed that to happen. They were the government. So why is it that the things that he complains about under the system that he was the minister of, he didn't just change them, make them better?
The Honourable Member from Cape Breton West.
Madam Speaker, on a point of order, obviously if the Honourable Member had at least listened to part of the dissertation that I presented with regards to the Medical Review Commission, he would have easily understood that that was the proactive measures to take to deal with the very issue. And I did not, at no point, and I'm sure the Honourable Member didn't mean to suggest that members of the Board of Directors were overruling specialists. It was the physicians of the board.
It's not a point of order, but it's an interesting point. Back to the Honourable Member from...
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank the member for the clarification, because all that's telling me is that while he was minister, he still didn't change it. He allowed that to happen. I have had people come to my office with complaints of...
The Honourable Member from Inverness would like to make an introduction.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for a moment of his time. I want to bring the House's attention to the Speaker's Gallery, and as you all know, we have been putting forward the Order of Nova Scotia recipients today, and a key player in playing a role in that obviously was the chair of the council who overtook that large responsibility, and I'd like to introduce and welcome Dr. Sharon Oliver here to the House and receive the warm welcome of everyone here.
Back to the Honourable Member from Hants East.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, yeah, I've had constituents come to my office and complain about the workers' compensation system. Matter of fact, some of the doctors that had been either members of the board, hired by the board, workers' compensation doctors is how I'm going to refer to them. I am sure that they they could not find anything wrong with any human being who had ever been before them. That the same complaint came time and time again. They mentioned the doctors by name, that these individuals could never find anything wrong with any of these people. It wouldn't matter if the person crawled in there on their elbows, there was nothing wrong with them. And I got to say that that is something that even bothers me yet to this day. Now, there seemed to be an awful concern about funding these people. Actually, there seemed to be a concern about taking care of these people. Now, we have no problem giving $155 checks this past summer, somewhere to the tune of $71 million. $9 million to Arenda Recip to produce airplane engines, which I think they produced 2, never had to pay the money back. A litany under the Savage Liberals, Dynatech, TexLink, you name it, dollars, taxpayers' dollars, millions of dollars that went to these companies that, within months were gone. No money ever came back. And money just given to Hershey just the other day or the last week or so. A company that is in such good financial condition, I think probably they were surprised. Well, they probably weren't surprised if they reviewed the history of governments in Nova Scotia. So, why is it that we can put money to all of those places, and yet when it came to taking care of injured workers in this province, Madam Speaker, man, that was tough. We had no money for them. Couldn't find any. Couldn't scrape it up. Couldn't beg, borrow. Well, maybe steal, I guess, but sure couldn't get it from any finance minister to take care of these injured workers. Now, to me, that only indicates the tone of the government. I have said it before in this House, you can't escape from who you are with your legislation. In other words, your legislation clearly defines your intent. Now, as much as people, I've had been to meetings, let's say, Federation of Agriculture meetings or whatever, and actually I heard of one meeting that there was a number of the Tory caucus had been there. I think the former Minister of Finance had been there, and the farmers who showed up at that meeting actually, they cornered some of these MLAs and the minister and said, about the lack of support for agriculture and what was going on. And they were, it wasn't us, it was the other guys. It was the other guys in the caucus, not those ones who were at the meeting. I had the Minister of Finance there. So I suppose if the other guys were at a meeting, then they'd blame the other fellas in the caucus. Well, these things don't happen by accident, Madam Speaker. Legislation that takes away rights from Nova Scotians has to be drafted and given some thought to it of what it means. And matter of fact, Madam Speaker, the opposition spent a fair bit of time trying to tell the government of the day what was wrong with that legislation. So it wasn't like somebody wasn't trying to inform them. People come out, I didn't know it was like that. Well, if anybody believes that. Now, people came to the previous law amendments on that bill back in '98, and they told some pretty horrific stories about their lives and their families. People were losing their homes, their marriages, and it would seem to me that nobody puts themselves through that if they couldn't work. If they could go out and work every day and have something, a home in particular, they'd be doing it. So this notion that somehow these people were out to rip off the government or the taxpayers is a ridiculous one. And the question would be, if you compensated them fairly, what would they do with the money? Well, they'd spend it. It would be money that circulated in the economy The government would get tax revenue from that, and this is not a loss to the province. As a matter of fact, keeping their children out of poverty is not a loss to the province. I mean, one of the highest drivers of health care costs is poverty. So what do? We instigate to create it. We put people in poverty and then spend money on health care, where all we had to do was take care of them. And if governments can't actually feel some compassion for injured workers, they can at least feel some compassion for their children. The ones who didn't get up that morning and go to work. It's been an interesting ride this time in the legislature. I think one of the most interesting moments for me was when the Tories brought in their 911 fee. And actually the member for Cape Breton West was here. Liberals, I think, were in this position in opposition where we're seated. And I think the member for Cape Breton West was the one who railed on the Minister of Health at the time, and what an injustice it was to bring in this 911 fee. And the Minister of Health stood up and said, "You guys signed it before you left." So how is it that people are to believe anything that the members from the Liberal caucus say in relation